Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining Ten2Two today for our business webinar on interviewing to secure the right candidate. As experts in flexible and part-time recruitment and consulting, we have a wealth of experience in this area, and we'd like to share some with you today. I'm Jane O'Gorman, Director of Ten2Two, and your co-host for today, and I will be keeping an eye out for any questions over the course of the session, which you can pop in the Q&A below. Now, we only have 30 minutes for the webinar, plus some added time for questions. So without any further ado, I would like to hand over to my lovely colleague, our MD, Deborah O'Sullivan, to kickstart the presentation. Deborah.
Thanks, Jane. And thanks to everyone who's joining us today. I hope you've got some lunch in front of you. Recruitment is one of the biggest investment decisions a business can make, not only in the recruitment process, the time, the fees. There's also the salary to consider and the onboarding and training costs that go with a new recruit. So it's really important you get it right. Now, interviewing is really just, the key part in that process, and there's work to be done before and after you've secured a candidate. So we're hoping to make those parts of the process the subjects of future webinars. But for today, we're just looking at the interview process. So you can actually do training courses on this, which take 3 or 5 days. So the fact we've only got really half an hour, this is really going to be a whistle-stop, difficult to say, whistle-stop tour. So I'm going to crack on, and we're going to cover, these are the areas we're going to cover. And its very nature, because we know some people don't interview very often, perhaps it's your first time, we're going to cover some basics, but hopefully we're going to touch on something that is of interest to you. Now, interviews, they're still the predominant way companies select their workforce. We're seeing more and more supplementation with testing, psychometrics, and slightly extended processes, but actually nothing has replaced the standard interview as yet. So what's the key point of an interview? So, first and foremost, what you want to do is establish that the candidate has the right skills appropriate to the job in question, that they have the ability to do the job, that their fit is good for the culture of the company that you have, and that the terms that you have match what the candidate's looking for. There's nothing more frustrating than thinking you've found the ideal candidate only to realise further down the line that they're actually looking for £10,000 more than your budget. So if you're using an agency, all of those term discussions would have happened pre-interview, but if you're recruiting yourself, it's something you may well cover at interview. And then secondly, the part of the interview process that perhaps some people overlook is how you want the candidate to feel at the end of the process. So you want the candidate to want the job you've got on offer. You want them to really like the company, to feel very engaged and to feel that the company is a great fit for them. And overall, you want them to have a positive experience so that they can become a brand ambassador for you, whether or not they are the successful candidate. And it's really important to remember that in every part of the process, people are touching on your business. So whatever the outcome, you want them to be positive when they talk about you. So what about the process? Now, we see lots of variety, particularly between big corporates and smaller businesses in terms of what processes they follow. Now, if you've got a process that works, absolutely stick to it. If you're reviewing your process, or perhaps you haven't got one yet, then there's some considerations to bear in mind. So the key one, and probably the biggest driver, is the level of the role you're recruiting for. If you're recruiting a senior, really important, expensive hire, you may want to consider extending the stages that you have. So you might add on a final stage, which is lunch with the founder, or perhaps a session with your company counsellor, perhaps a presentation to the board. If it's a low level, maybe an entry level role, which actually doesn't have much impact across the business, maybe 1 or 2 stages would suffice. So that's probably the key consideration, which is what level is the role you're recruiting for. So then number of stages, we often get asked about, how many stages should I have? The level of role comes into that, and also how many people are involved in that process. So the most typical example we see, and certainly since the pandemic, where video interviewing has become much more commonplace, we will see a video interview as the first formal stage, and the second stage would likely be a face-to-face with one or two stakeholders and maybe some testing. So that's a fairly typical process. Now, it does depend if you're pre-screening. So if you're using an agency like Ten2Two or another agency, they will do pre-screening for you. So the candidates you're meeting will know the terms, they'll know the company, they'll know more about the role, and therefore you won't have to do that yourself. If you're having to do that yourself, then that's the stage before a formal interview. That's a 20-minute phone call, half an hour phone call, to check that it's worth everybody taking the time to interview. So interviewing does take a lot of time and commitment, and it's important to get it right, but you don't want to be wasting your time or indeed the candidate's time if there's an obvious not fit at the beginning of the process. The other thing you need to consider is how many people you want in the process. So again, if it's only a couple of people in the team and the role isn't going to impact very many other areas, it might just be the hiring manager. If it's a big, important role touching many parts of the business, you might decide you need 3, 4, maybe 5 people involved in the process. So what you don't want to do is get to the end of a process and somebody say, oh, but I didn't meet them. And then you have to bring the candidate in again for a final session. So you want to get that sorted right up front. In terms of formatting, I mentioned video. We're seeing video interviewing much more. That works really well in the early stages. But we get feedback from our clients that nothing quite replaces that face-to-face at some point in the process. So we're seeing that coming back in force. And then testing. Not everybody does testing. In fact, I would say it's probably 50-50, if that. But if you've got a particularly technical role, or there's a certain psychometric profile you're looking for, then we are seeing clients supplementing more with different types of testing, just to add on to the process. And I'd stress that you should never really just go on the results of a test, unless it really is black and white, like a technical test. They should inform the overall opinion of a candidate rather than be a yes or no black and white decision. So that's the process. Then a really important part of interviewing is prepping. And this is the preparation that you or the people interviewing needs to do. So it's worth spending time here because it makes the process go so much smoother when you're actually face-to-face with the candidate. So the first thing to do is to review the job spec and prepare the questions in relation to the job spec. So if there are 5 key competencies that you want the candidates to have, then build your questioning around those competencies, and they should come directly from the job description. You need to make sure your job description is accurate and correct before you go into the process, and that, as I say, is the part of the pre-process. But assuming your job spec is correct, identify the key questions you want to ask to match the job spec. Then, of course, read the candidate CV. The candidate CVs are still the biggest currency we have in the job market. And there's lots of things in the background that are looking to replace it, video interviewing, where you get little snippets sent through to your email. But the candidate CV is still the best way to see what somebody has done and what they've achieved. As you go through the candidate CV, take a look for things that stand out to you. So make a note of their key achievements that you want to delve into more. If you're not working with an agency, highlight any red flags that you think don't resonate with you. So maybe lots of hopping around jobs, or potentially lots of short contracts, maybe a big gap that's not explained. If you're working with an agency, they'll explain all that from their pre-screening calls with the candidates. So if you're working with an agency, they will provide you with a profile of that candidate. And it's really worth reading that in detail, because that will give you colour to add on top of the CV. So you'll have a much fuller picture when you meet the candidate face to face of what they're about. Oh, Jane, I can see you've got your hand up.
I'm here with my hand up. Can I just interject just one question while we're on this stage here that's popped up? Is it always better to ask the candidates the same questions while we're thinking about preparing questions?
Absolutely. We'll go on. We're going to cover some questioning and the type of question formats you can go for. But yes, in the main, it's much better to have comparable questions, because then you can compare the candidates more easily. So I would say yes, where possible. Okay, so then moving on to some basics, but some things that often get overlooked. In terms of etiquette, this was much more complicated during the pandemic, because of course we had all the discussions about should I shake hands and shouldn't I. We're seeing that much calmer now, but still keep that in mind in case you've got nervous candidates or nervous hiring managers who want to set certain ground rules in relation to COVID. But putting that aside, these are the two areas we would consider. So beforehand, you want to make sure the candidates are fully briefed in advance with plenty of notice. So candidates do like to prepare. They want to know what's expected of them. You don't want it to be a test. They're going to be nervous enough. So try and give as much information as you can right up front, including any company information that might be useful to them that they might not be able to easily access online. In that, allow enough time. And we see this happen quite a lot, where people are trying to rush the interview process. And I would once again go back to, this is a really big investment. It's worth setting time aside, both to do the interviews and to think through the interview outcomes. So always allow enough time for the interview. We would say at least an hour if you're face-to-face, with 15 minutes break between, both to give yourself a bit of a rest and to write up notes. Remember to consider any adaptations that have been requested, such as wheelchair access. If you're online interviewing, goes without saying really, but check your surroundings, that they're not distracting and that they're appropriate and professional, and make sure your tech is working, because there's really nothing worse than having a nervous interviewee and then the interviewer not having tech that's working. So it's worth doing that. So on the day, greet and reassure. So we're looking to make the candidate as comfortable as possible so that you can get the best out of them and be able to see them in their best light. So whoever's meeting them, make sure they're briefed to be nice, to greet them and reassure them. And if it's you, you can do the same. Be on time. So this is the same thing about allowing enough time. Even if the interview you're having beforehand is going really well and you really like to talk for another half an hour, don't. You really want to be respectful to the candidates and the process, and make sure you stick to your agenda. Set the tone and agenda of the meeting. The candidate will be expecting you to do that. That's even more important online, because you've got that slightly stilted behavior over the internet. We'd always recommend you make notes, particularly if you're interviewing, if your interviews aren't on the same day and maybe they're spread. So keep notes, but try not to fixate on them. And I always suggest you talk to the candidate and say, look, I will be taking notes, don't mind me, I'm still listening. But it's useful to have them to refer back to. And then if you're not using an agency, this is the point that you may well check ID if you haven't done it beforehand. So you need to check someone's got the right to work in the UK. An agency would do that before you got to interview stage. But if you're not using an agency, you would need to do that either at this point or before an offer's made. We're right, Jane, with questions?
For the moment, yeah, absolutely, plug on.
Okay, cool. So moving on to the structure of the interview. So people often ask us about timings. So what's the ideal? This is a description of a typical hour interview that works very well. So we're gonna, the areas that are slightly shaded, we're gonna go on and talk about in a little bit more detail in the following slides. That's why they're different color. So first and foremost, 10 minutes or so, describing and explaining. And by this, I'm talking about describing the company, describing the role, explaining how the role has come about. Pitching the role is the way to think of it, because this is your opportunity to promote your company, what it's achieved, what its ambitions are, and how brilliant the job is. And so leaving the candidate really excited about wanting the job. So that's about 10 minutes, and it helps relax everybody, actually. if you're prepared. So that comes back to your preparation earlier. So then the bulk of the interview will be you and your colleagues questioning. So we say 30 to 35 minutes of asking questions, and we'll go on to talk about what types of questions you could ask to get the information you want. While you're asking the questions, probe, listen, feedback, try and make the interview conversational rather than ask a question, get an answer, because it just feels a bit stilted. And that does come with practice. If you're new to interviewing, it might feel a bit awkward to start with, but you'll get much better at it the more you do. Whilst you're asking the questions, we recommend that you take notes and measure. We're going to talk about measurement in a second, but it's really helpful if you do that during the interview. And then allow 10 minutes at least to give the candidates the floor. So make it absolutely clear that they have the right to ask any questions they want. If the candidate is really keen on the job, they're going to have loads of questions to ask. So be prepared to have a conversation and give honest answers towards the end. And that's often a really good way to get an insight, because by that point, the candidate's more relaxed. You're likely to get some nuggets out of that little 10-minute session at the end. Jane, I can see there's a question.
You've actually touched on it, Deborah, anyway, but we're just thinking about the very first point here, talking about describing and explaining. A couple of questions coming through, but in this particular area, about whether the candidate really should have done their homework on the company anyway beforehand. And I think you obviously mentioned in the beginning, this is actually an opportunity for the company to actually present the attractions of the company and really give a little bit more colour on the culture. So I think it's always valuable, even though we would expect a little bit of research to have been done beforehand, to still give that first representation of what the company is about. I think you would agree, Deborah.
Absolutely. I would say candidates should always come prepared, knowing about the company, because there's just no excuse nowadays. It's so easy to find information, but that's always public information that might not give the true sense of the company, or there might be stuff that you can embellish. So, and as you said, Jane, it's an opportunity to promote, which is really important in the interview process. And particularly, the candidate market is hot at the moment. We've got offers and counter offers going on the whole time. So you want the candidate to want your job, if you want them. So we've given the candidates the floor, and then just in the last 5 minutes, outline next steps. So the candidate leaves the room absolutely clear on whether there's a second stage, whether there's testing, whether there is going to be a decision in the next 2 days, whatever it is, just leave the candidate knowing what the next steps are. So that's the structure. So I'm now going to talk a little bit more about the type of questioning and then how to measure in an interview. So competency-based interviews, they're often referred to in different terms, but they can be called structured, behavioural or situational interviews. But the main point of them is that they test skills and competencies, and they target specific skills related to the job in question. They're not just, what can you do for the company? Why do you think you're good for the job? They are specific questions with predetermined criteria. So you know what you're looking for in the answers. And the basis of this is that a candidate's past behaviour is going to be the best indicator of their future performance. So you can, of course, ask those open questions and just have a conversation. But if you're in a formal process with a structured interview, then you really want to use competency or structured questions. So what do those questions look like? So as I say, we're looking for past behaviour indicating how someone might behave in the future. So you might start your questioning with something really simple around their work history so that you can establish some facts against the CV. This is a nice opener in an interview because the candidate feels relaxed. It's obviously something they're comfortable talking about, and you can do some fact checking. So it might be a really simple question. Can you briefly talk me through your CV? Simple. Then, if you're moving on to competency-based questioning, this will be based on the skills you've identified that are needed to do the job. So If, for instance, teamwork is one of the competencies you're looking for, you might ask a question such as, tell me about a time when you supported a colleague who was struggling with an area of work. And how the candidate answers that will give you a good indication on whether they're good at teamwork. Or perhaps you've got customer focus as one of your competencies. This could be a question you might use to answer that. Explain to me how you ensure you deliver the best customer service. So there's lots and lots of examples of this type of questioning online. The best way of doing it is to identify what competencies you're looking for and design your questions around that. There are some other types of questioning. So you'll hear behavioural questioning is often talked about. And the idea of these, which is slightly different from competency, is that it shows how the candidate might think in a given situation. So a good example is failure. A time when you didn't meet a goal, how did you handle it? That lets you see how resilient a candidate might be. Another example could be something, tell me about a time when you had to persuade someone who was resistant to you how to perform a task. So that would touch on leadership. So they're very similar to competency-based, but more about checking how the candidate behaves in certain situations, often situations under pressure. And then finally, if you've got company values, then you might want to ask a question about the candidate's values to see if they align. And that could be something, if one of your company values is integrity, you might ask a question about when they've demonstrated integrity. Or more generally, you could just say, tell us about a time when you worked for a company that matched your values, which would allow you to explore a whole raft of values that the candidate would obviously feel is important. And of course, within the whole thing, just remember to probe and listen well. Excuse me. So that's the questions. If we move on to measuring, I hope everyone's still with us. I feel like I'm doing a lot of talking here.
You are. Yeah, I'll just interject. There's a few questions around types of questions, or, you know, what should we ask at that first stage? And I think this has been probably quite useful just to give an indication of how to determine what those questions should be and how to define them by looking at some of the things you've mentioned there, Deborah. So a lot of interest around this area, and perhaps something that we can share some examples. We will be sharing this anyway, but some examples of questions particularly aligned to each of these, but certainly interested in how that looks.
Sure. And the key thing, of course, is what we touched on at the very beginning, which is you need to know what the competencies are within the job spec you've got. So if that's not right, your whole interview process won't go smoothly. You'll recruit the wrong person if you haven't got the right job description. That's the subject of another webinar. Okay, so I'm going to move on to measuring. I touched on this earlier. Measuring just gives you a more objective hiring process. So you don't have to do it, but it does add structure. It gives you consistency, particularly, as I said, if you're interviewing over a period of time. It's really easy in a busy couple of days to forget the candidate you saw on a Monday when you're then interviewing on a Wednesday. So it's really good for that. It can be a little stilting. So again, I would always say, mention it to the candidate, say that you'll be making notes and not ask them not to be put off, and try not to be fixated on it. But again, this comes with practice. And I think if you have a good tool, we'll go on to that, then actually it can be quite a quick process, so it doesn't distract too much from what's going on in the room. Define your scoring in advance and discuss it with other stakeholders. So if you know further down the line there's going to be other people involved in the process, make sure they're on side with what questions you're asking, how you're measuring, and what the scoring is likely to be. And then finally, rather than just score against the hard questions you're asking, you can always add a couple of excuse me, additional soft categories. So something like professionalism or sense of humour, timekeeping, you know, something like that, which wouldn't necessarily come out of the question, but might just be your overall impression of the candidate. So I've got a little example here of a scoring sheet. So this is a scoring sheet for 5 candidates being asked 6 questions, and each question is marked out of 5. And the key thing here is if you see at the bottom of the slide, there's predetermined criteria about what is good and what isn't good. So once you're familiar with that, it's quite quick after the candidate's finished answering a question to put in a mark for them. And one would hope by the end of your process of interviewing 5 candidates, this would allow you to quickly look back and go, yep, there's 2 standout candidates in this mix. Let's take both of them forward. So it's really a handy tool to use when you're interviewing a number of candidates. So what to avoid? So the Equality Act 2010 outlines 9 protected characteristics, which are listed here. Lots of employers aren't aware that actually a candidate at interview has the same rights as an employee under this act. So anything that you wouldn't do for an employee, you shouldn't do for a candidate at interview. I'd always recommend that you, if you're unsure about any of this area, to speak to your HR consultant or your internal HR people. Our advice is just steer clear of all the protected characteristics unless you're absolutely sure you need to touch on them. So you're nearly there. You're nearly at the finishing line. What do you need to do? You need to collate feedback quickly. So if there's more than one person or number of stages across multiple stakeholders, collate the feedback quickly and build time in for that right early on when you're prepping so that that doesn't delay the process. You want to keep the candidates informed either via the agency or directly. And if there's any delay, maybe someone's a key decision maker's on holiday, or you actually need more time to think it through, let candidates know. Don't just leave them hanging. I can see a hand up.
Yeah, just a quick interjection there. A quick question on feedback, because you mentioned give feedback quickly. If you're using an agency, is it okay to respond directly to the candidates? What's the protocol?
Okay, so if you're using an agency, we would always say keep the communication lines the same as they've always been through the agency. We do sometimes, clients sometimes want to deliver the good news and make the offer, which is fine, but I would always say go to the agency first, let them know that's what you want to do, and take it that way. But if you're using an agency, the idea is that you are having everything managed on your behalf. So it's one point of contact for the candidate, one point of contact for you. It makes everything very seamless. Okay, so make offer as soon as possible. I mentioned earlier, the candidate market is mad at the moment. So if you know you've found your candidate, don't hesitate. Make an offer as soon as possible, and ideally within 48 hours. So research has shown that if you tip over into the 48-hour mark, candidates think they've been unsuccessful and they start opting out of the process. So you really don't want to tip over into that. And give feedback, again, with an aim of within 48 hours, and that's to everybody. If you're using an agency, the agency will do the feedback on your behalf. If you're doing it directly, don't think, oh, well, I've got my perfect candidate and let's not worry about the other 5 people that came along. Interviewing is, it's costly and it takes a lot of time, and candidates do put a lot of effort into every interview they go for. So make sure you show some respect and give feedback as quickly as you can. Okay, so top tips, final slide. Everything we've covered, prepare in advance. That really does make all the difference. Think about the competencies required for the job and then set your whole process up to mirror that. Listen well whilst people are giving you answers. Focus on the skills and the fit for the role. Allow for nerves. I only touch on this gently, but do allow for nerves. Doesn't matter how senior the role is. We see very, very senior candidates who are brilliant, still get nervous at the thought of an interview. So make a little bit of an allowance for nerves and be kind to yourself as well, because we know interviewers also get very nervous. Also allow for personality types. So if it's not a type of role that requires an extrovert, you're not going to get extroverted candidates. So they might be a little bit more challenging to get information out of. So you might want some backup questions if you're recruiting for that type of role. We touched earlier, ask everyone comparable questions. Embrace talent. And by this, I mean, don't be put off if somebody appears overqualified. We've had clients have great success with recruiting above their own abilities. So don't rule people out because you think they're overqualified. Measure responses using some kind of template and follow up quickly. So that's our quick whiz through the interview process. Is there any extra questions, Jane?
Yeah, a couple of extra questions there. So we've touched on it in the slides, but just to recap, and from our own experience as well, a few questions around what the typical number of stages in an interview process would be. I think from our perspective, what we often see, and you touched on it, Deborah, is potentially the telephone interview, the most typical, the telephone interview, or video interview, basically one or the other, and then a face-to-face. We actually have some clients who are doing everything, and simply because of the circumstances over the last couple of years with COVID, that everything's been done remotely. But we are seeing a step back into face-to-face. And certainly where there is a requirement, there will be a practical, whether that be, say, for a finance role, testing practical skills and technical knowledge there, marketing presentations. But what they do is actually at least communicate well in advance, so the candidates are prepared and they know that those practicals are coming up. It's not a last minute, oh, and by the way, and we just would like you to do this practical today while you're here. So it's all about managing expectations and allowing for time to prepare. And that all helps and adds to the interview process and gives a very, very good representation of the company at the same time. Is there anything you would like to add to that, Deborah, or have I covered on that on stages?
I think the only thing I would say is, you know, be mindful of everybody's time. And I think if you do that prep up front, then you can get all the stakeholders involved in a shorter process. And what I would say is, if you've got a lot of people involved in the process, then it's better to have more people per interview than stretch the process out. So we have had instances where there's been 8 stages. It's too many. By that time, the candidates, you know, thinking, well, how many more hoops have I got to jump through? So I think, you know, what you've outlined, Jane, is about right. 2 or 3 stages, maybe testing if it's that sort of role.
Okay. Another interesting question here. Is it a good idea to have a dedicated note taker in the room to allow interviewers to concentrate on the meeting?
It's a great idea. And if you can afford the resource in the process, yeah, it's a great idea. As long as that person would understand the preset criteria for how you're measuring. But yeah, I think that's great if you can afford the time.
And interestingly, there's 2 points here, perhaps, if we can cover. One, is there a limit to the number of people who should be doing the interview? And we see quite a mix in terms of our panel interviews, and whether it's worth including other members of the company, you know, team members, to give a little bit flavour of the culture. Is that worthwhile interview process too?
Yes. So what you don't want to do is overwhelm candidates and take up too much time early in the process. But I think when you get to 1 or 2 preferred candidates, then having a walk around the office, saying hi to other team members, I think that's really beneficial in terms of pitching the role again to the candidate, making them want that job. So yeah, I think that's a good idea, but you don't want to do it too early on because it just becomes laborious for everybody.
I agree. One here in the sense of, is it okay to specify dress code for an interview? I appreciate we can't dictate, but we do. I know from our experience, we often will have clients, perhaps say in the creative industry, who will say, oh, please tell them not to worry about being suited and booted, because, you know, we're a very informal organization. We want the candidate to feel comfortable on the day of the interview, and that might actually set the tone off on the wrong foot. So I think there are occasions when it can be a kind thing to do. Would you like to add anything? Do you agree?
I agree that if there is a dress code, it's better to say as much. You know, we always recommend our candidates check out websites and LinkedIn profiles of the people who work at the company to give them a good feel for what type of dress there is. But, you know, dress is a bit strange since the pandemic. There's lots more casual dress. So particularly if you want formal dress, if your environment is formal, it's very good to say that, I think, because, you know, that it's just stretched what people now think of business wear as.
Yeah. Another here, is it okay to let a candidate know they're second in line?
Oh, so this is a tricky one, and we do get this quite a lot, actually. If you are able to turn things around quickly, then you don't have to do that. So my view is that you don't really want someone to think they're second choice. This is the start of a very, hopefully, long and meaningful relationship. So you don't want them to start their relationship thinking that they were second in line. So if you can offer your preferred candidate and hopefully quickly turn it around quickly so that you know whether they're going to accept or not, you can just put a holding message to that second candidate and keep them warm whilst you're having that other discussion. If it's going to go on a long time, so let's say your preferred candidate, I don't know, can't resign for a week, so you're putting a big delay in the process, that's the point I would say, yes, you say to somebody, you're their second choice, or you're our second choice. Are you okay to wait? We'll have a decision by X. So I would say not if you can help it, but if you think you might lose the candidate, then yes.
Yeah, worth having that chat. Okay. I've got one final one here, I think, in terms of if it's not going so well. So this is a different scenario where actually, if you're going through the interview process, but actually it's not going as well and you have allowed that time, should you cut short the interview, or should you still, you touched on it earlier, Deborah, you said give the candidate the floor. So do we still do that? Do we still give the candidate the floor, or do we say, thank you very much, and cut short the interview?
So I would say, if it's not going well, do a quick check yourself. Have I relaxed the candidate? Am I asking, am I being clear in my questioning? But particularly if it's maybe the first candidate you've ever interviewed. If you really don't think it's going very well, you could cut it a little bit short. But what I would say is that candidate is still having an experience of your brand and of your company. And you don't want them to leave after 10 minutes going, well, they didn't even give me a chance. So I would say maybe if you've decided it's a definite no in the interview, maybe cut out 1 or 2 questions, but still go through a process that makes it feel like the candidate has had a chance to show what they can do.
Great, smashing. I think that's it for now, Deborah, actually. So we're good to go. Thanks so much for that. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And we do hope you've enjoyed and found the webinar useful. We will follow up. So there has been a couple of requests over the course of the session about some of the things that we've mentioned in terms of questions, and also around the slides and the grading, the tracking, things like that. So rest assured that after the webinar, we will be following up with copies of the slides. And also, if there's some questions that we haven't come back on now, if it needs a little bit more detail, then we'll follow up with you after the webinar. There will also be there on that, if you do want to grab some one-to-one time, there'll be a link to my Calendly diary if you want to block some time in our diary for that too. But in the meantime, thank you from Ten2Two for joining us this afternoon. It's been a pleasure hosting. Thank you, Deborah, for all your helpful tips today. Have a lovely afternoon, everyone, and we hope you'll join us in another webinar soon. Bye for now.